The sky over the Wyoming Territory had turned the color of a fresh bruise. It wasn't just rain that fell from it, but a biblical fury of ice and wind that clawed at the very soul of the land. In this maelstrom, a lone woman, tougher than the unforgiving earth she farmed, found a man half swallowed by the mud. He was a whisper away from death, a bullet hole in his side, weeping a dark stain into the freezing rain. She didn't know his name, his sin, or his virtue. She only knew he was a man, and she wasn't the kind to let even a wolf die alone in a storm. Dragging his dead weight through the gale, she was fighting for a stranger's life, never knowing that in saving him, she was binding him to hers with an oath that could only be paid in blood. The wind howled like a chorus of grieving mothers. It tore across the high plains of the Powder River country, a relentless, shrieking force that scoured the land down to its bones. Lillian Brewer, her face weathered to the color of worn leather by sun, and hardship leaned into the gale, the coarse fabric of her oilcloth coat snapping violently against her tall frame. Every year, the autumn storms seemed to get meaner, as if the land itself was trying to shrug off the stubborn few who dared to scratch a living from its hide. Her homestead, a small sturdy sod house and a lean-to barn, was a lonely island in a sea of rust-colored grass. Her father, a man with more hope than sense, had built it with his own 2 hands before a cattle baron's bullet had put an end to his dreams 5 years prior. Now it was just Lily. Lily and the unending sky, the ceaseless wind, and the memory of a father who taught her that survival was not a choice, but a duty. She was securing the last of the shutters on the barn when she saw it, a flicker of unnatural darkness against the grey torrents near Cottonwood Creek. It wasn't a rock and it wasn't a fallen log. It was slumped, a broken shape that had no place in the landscape. Her first instinct, honed by years of solitude and caution, was to retreat into the safety of her home and bar the door. The plains were full of men who were better off left to their own fate. But her father's voice, a low rumble in her memory, echoed a different lesson. Decency, Lily. It's the one thing they can't take from you, unless you give it away. With a curse that was snatched away by the wind, she grabbed a coil of rope from the barn and trudged towards the creek. The rain was freezing now, a curtain of sleet that stung her cheeks. As she got closer, the shape resolved into a man, face down, in the mud at the water's edge. He was dressed in the worn remnants of what might have been a U.S. cavalry uniform, though it was now tattered and dark with mud and something else. Blood. She rolled him over. He was big, broad-shouldered, with a square jaw covered in dark stubble. A gash on his forehead bled freely, but that wasn't the worst of it. His left side was a sodden, dark mess. A bullet wound, ugly and deep. He was breathing, but each inhale was a shallow, rattling thing. His skin was deathly cold. He couldn't have been more than 30, but the lines of pain etched around his eyes made him look a century old. "Damn you," she muttered, not to him, but to the situation. Dragging a dead man was one thing. A living one was a different kind of burden entirely. He was a heavy man, all muscle and bone, and her own strength, though considerable, was stretched to its limit. She looped the rope under his arms, knotted it, and slung the other end over her shoulder. The journey back to the soddy was a trial by fire, or rather by ice and mud. It was less than 300 yards, but it felt like miles. She dug her heels into the slick earth, her muscles screaming with every step. The man's dead weight was an anchor, pulling her back, threatening to drag them both down into the mire. The storm raged, a physical manifestation of the chaos that had just entered her meticulously ordered life. Twice, she slipped her face, plunging into the freezing mud, the taste of grit and iron filling her mouth. The man groaned once, a low, guttural sound that spurred her on. Finally gasping for breath, her lungs burning, she hauled him over the threshold of her home. The heavy plank door slammed shut behind them, muffling the storm's fury to a dull roar. The sudden relative silence was deafening. Inside the small room was warm, lit by the gentle orange glow of a fire in the stone hearth. It was a space of order and peace, a sanctuary she had built for herself. And now she had dragged the savage, bleeding world right into the middle of it. She cut away the tattered, soaked fabric of his coat and shirt. The wound was worse than she'd thought. Angry inflamed the flesh around it, a bruised purple. It was a clean through and through, but the bleeding hadn't stopped entirely, and infection was already setting in. She looked at his face now, slack in the firelight. He had no weapon on him, no saddlebags, nothing to say who he was or what trouble he was running from. He was a blank slate of a man, and for all she knew, he could be a saint or a devil. Lillian Brewer took a deep breath, pushing a stray strand of damp brown hair from her face. It didn't matter. He was a human life, flickering like a candle in the wind, and tonight her small, lonely home would be the shield that kept that flame from being extinguished. She stoked the fire, put a pot of water on to boil, and reached for the carbolic acid and clean linens. The storm could have the world outside, but in here, she was the one who made the rules. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the sputtering of the tallow lamps and the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the packed earth roof. Lily worked with a grim, practiced efficiency that belied the turmoil in her gut. She had set broken bones on calves and stitched up her own flesh more than once, but this was different. This was a man's life, resting beneath her hands, and his hold on it was tenuous. She cleaned the wound as best she could with boiled water, and a dose of whiskey poured directly into the raw flesh. The man arched in agony, a strangled cry escaping his lips, but he remained unconscious. His fever began to climb a dry, consuming heat that radiated from his skin. She bathed his face and chest with cool cloths, watching the lines of pain deepen around his eyes and mouth. He was trapped in a nightmare world, his body a battlefield between life and death. Throughout the night and into the next day, he thrashed in a feverish delirium. He spoke, but the words were a broken jumble of memories and fears. He called out names, Jenkins, Sergeant, and places that meant nothing to her, Shenandoah, Cold Harbor. They were the ghosts of a war that had ended a decade ago, but clearly still raged within him. But one name he repeated more than any other, a venomous guttural whisper. Corcoran. The name was spat out like a curse, often followed by a string of violent half-formed phrases. The ledger. Damn your black heart, Corcoran. Took it all. Lily listened her suspicion, a cold knot in her stomach. Ledger Corcoran. It sounded like the business of outlaws or thieves. Her father had been murdered over a dispute about water rights, but the men who did it were part of a gang that extorted and stole from honest homesteaders. They were faceless villains in her memory, but they had a name like Corcoran. They had a leader who saw men not as flesh and blood, but as obstacles or tools. By the third day, the fever broke. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a sky of impossible blue. The man's breathing evened out, the rattling in his chest subsided, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. Lily, exhausted to her bones, finally allowed herself to rest, slumping into a chair by the hearth, a heavy Winchester rifle resting across her lap. She had saved him, but she still didn't know if she had invited a fox into her henhouse. He awoke in the late afternoon. His eyes opened slowly, the color of faded denim, and for a long moment they held only confusion. He tried to sit up, but a sharp intake of breath and a wince of pain stopped him. "Easy now." Lily's voice was low and steady, betraying none of the exhaustion she felt. "You try to move like that again, you'll tear my stitches." His gaze found her. He took in the sparse but clean room, the rifle in her lap, and her weary but resolute face. There was a long silence filled only by the crackle of the fire. "Where?" He finally rasped his voice, rough with disuse. "My home. Found you by the creek. You've been out for 3 days." He absorbed this, his eyes closing for a moment. "The storm. It passed," she said simply. She stood and walked over, ladling some thin broth from a pot over the fire into a bowl. "You need to eat. And I need a name." He watched her, his expression guarded, cautious. This was the moment. The moment he would either offer a truth or a lie. He was a trained soldier. She could see the discipline in the set of his jaw, even in his weakened state. He was assessing her, weighing his options. "Wade," he said at last. "Wade Donovan. I'm Lillian Brewer. Folks call me Lily." She handed him the bowl. His hand trembled as he took it. "Who shot you?" "Wade Donovan." Again the hesitation. A flicker of something dark moved in his eyes. "Bushwhackers tried to take my horse." It was a plausible lie, a common one, but it didn't explain the fevered whispers. It didn't explain the venom in his voice when he spoke the name Corcoran. Lily didn't challenge him. She simply nodded her face, an unreadable mask. Trust like a good crop didn't grow overnight. It needed time and it needed tending, and sometimes it needed to be tested by fire. "Well, Mr. Donovan," she said, turning back to the hearth. "You rest. Your horse is gone, and your shooters are long gone. For now you're just a wounded man. We'll worry about the rest later." But she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the rest was already on its way. The name Corcoran was a shadow, and she had a dreadful feeling it was stretching long and dark all the way to her front door. 20 miles east in the burgeoning, mud-choked town of Redemption Creek, a man named Lawrence Corcoran leaned against the bar of the Gilded Cage Saloon, a glass of cheap whiskey in his hand. He was a man who looked perpetually out of place. His suit was too fine for the dust-caked floorboards, his hands too clean for a man of the West. But it was his eyes that set him apart. They were the color of a winter sky, cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of warmth. With him were 2 of his men, Hank and Peterson, brutish counterparts to their leader's refined cruelty. The buzzards would have picked him clean by now. Peterson grumbled, wiping beer foam from his thick mustache. "We searched the whole damn creek bed after the storm. Nothing. The flood must have taken him." Corcoran took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze fixed on his own reflection in the murky mirror behind the bar. "Donovan is not a man to be taken by a flood." He said, his voice a low, cultured purr that was more menacing than any shout. "He is resourceful, and he is resilient. I have seen him take a Confederate bayonet to the leg and march 10 miles the next day. A single bullet and a storm are not enough to convince me." "But the ledger?" Hank asked, his voice laced with anxiety. "If he's alive—" "He did not have it on him," Corcoran said, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "We searched him thoroughly before he made his spectacular escape. He must have stashed it somewhere before our confrontation, which means if he is alive, he will eventually try to retrieve it." Wade Donovan had been more than just a nuisance. He had served under Corcoran's command during the war, a corporal of uncommon ability and unnerving integrity. When Corcoran had begun his lucrative post-war enterprise, using their old unit to steal army payrolls and extort protection money from fledgling settlements, all while bribing territorial officials, Donovan had been the one man he couldn't recruit. Instead, Donovan had gone to the U.S. Marshals. He had spent the last 6 months gathering evidence, meticulously documenting every crime, every name, every illicit transaction in a small, leather-bound ledger. That ledger was Corcoran's death warrant. It not only implicated his entire operation, but also named a very powerful territorial judge, Judge Merritt, as his silent partner. If that book ever made it to Cheyenne, they would all hang. "So what's the plan, boss?" Peterson asked. Corcoran placed his glass on the bar with a soft click. "We change our objective. We are no longer hunting for a body. We are hunting for a ghost, a wounded ghost. He will need help. A doctor, a farmer, a priest, someone will have taken him in. We will spread out. You and Hank will ride the territories north of the creek. I will handle the town. I want you to ask questions, not about a man named Donovan, but about strangers. About anyone who bought laudanum or an excess of bandages. About a farmer who suddenly seems distracted, or a doctor who made an unscheduled trip into the countryside." He turned from the bar, his cold eyes sweeping over his men. "Find where he landed. Find who is helping him. And when you do burn the place to the ground, the ledger is our priority, but leaving witnesses is a luxury we cannot afford." He placed a few coins on the bar and walked out into the muddy street, his polished boots sinking into the filth. He looked out towards the west, towards the vast, empty plains, where Lillian Brewer was at that very moment helping Wade Donovan take his first unsteady steps across her cabin floor. Back at the homestead, the days settled into a quiet rhythm. Wade was a surprisingly good patient. He did as he was told, ate what he was given, and never complained. His strength returned, slowly, painstakingly. First he was able to sit up, then stand, then limp around the small cabin. A silent understanding grew between them. Lily never asked about Corcoran again, and Wade never offered any more information than his initial lie. But the truth hung in the air between them, unspoken but ever present. He watched her work, marveling at her competence and strength. She moved with an economy of motion, whether she was chopping wood, tending her small garden, or cleaning her rifle. She was a solitary woman, but she was not a weak one. One afternoon, as she was kneading dough, he spoke from his chair by the fire. "My father was a blacksmith," he said, his voice quiet. "Back in Ohio, he used to say you could tell the quality of the steel by the way it held up to the hammer and the flame." Lily didn't stop her work. "What's your point, Donovan?" "My point," he said, his gaze meeting hers, "is that you've been through the fire. I can see it." She paused, her hands covered in flour. His observation was too astute, too close to the bone. "The world is the fire," she replied flatly. "We all go through it." "True," he conceded. "But not everyone comes out stronger. Some just turn to ash." The conversation was the most personal. They'd had a small crack in the wall of polite distance they had maintained. Lily found herself strangely unnerved by it. It was one thing to tend to a man's physical wounds, but another entirely to let him see the scars on her soul. That evening, as she watched him sleep, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his face, she felt a profound sense of dread. He was right. She had been forged in the fire of her father's murder and the hardship that followed. She had become hard, self-reliant steel. But she feared that Wade Donovan was the hammer and the man named Corcoran was the flame, and they had brought their forge right to her doorstep. She was no longer just a homesteader. She was a harbor, and a storm was coming to reclaim the man she had sheltered. The first snow of the season came early, a fine white powder that dusted the plains and clung to the sparse branches of the cottonwoods. It was a beautiful and dangerous thing, erasing the landscape, but also making any tracks easy to follow. The cold drove them indoors, forcing them into a proximity that was both comforting and tense. Wade was almost fully healed. The wound was a puckered, angry scar on his side, but the pain had dulled to a persistent ache. He had regained his strength, and with it a restless energy. He spent his days helping Lily his movements, still stiff but resolute. He chopped a mountain of firewood, repaired the leaky barn roof, and reinforced the corral fence. He worked with a silent, focused intensity, as if physical labor could somehow atone for the danger he had brought upon her. Their conversations remained clipped, practical, revolving around chores and weather. Yet in the shared silences, a different language was spoken. It was in the way he watched her, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, more protective. It was in the way she would leave a plate of food for him by the fire, a small, unspoken gesture of care. They were two solitary souls who had found a strange, temporary orbit around one another. One night, as a wolf howled its lonely song to the new snow, Wade knew he could no longer maintain the silence. The lie he had told was a debt, and the interest was compounding with every act of kindness she showed him. She was cleaning her rifle at the small wooden table, the lamplight glinting off the oiled steel. "Lily," he began, his voice low. He was standing by the window looking out at the vast moonlit expanse of white. She didn't look up, her hands moving with practiced familiarity over the weapon's mechanism. "The men who shot me. They weren't just bushwhackers." She stopped her work. Slowly she placed the cleaning rod on the table and looked at him. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were sharp, expectant. She had been waiting for this. He turned from the window to face her fully. "His name is Lawrence Corcoran. We served together in the war. He was a captain. I was his corporal." He told her everything. He spoke of the war, of Corcoran's charisma that curdled into cruelty, and of the criminal enterprise he built from the ashes of their old unit. He explained his work for the U.S. Marshals, the months spent undercover riding with the very men he used to call brothers in arms, and he told her about the ledger. "It's not just a list of names and dates," he explained, his voice tight with a cold fury. "It's his whole world, every stolen payroll, every bribe to Judge Merritt in Cheyenne, every homesteader he squeezed off their land. It's all in there. It's the only thing that can bring him down." Lily listened, her face impassive, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the table. Judge Merritt. The name hit her like a physical blow. He was the same judge who had dismissed the case against the cattle baron who'd had her father killed, citing a lack of evidence. It had all been a sham, a legal execution of justice. "Where is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This ledger." Wade limped over to the hearth. He reached deep into the chimney, dislodging a loose stone she had never noticed. From the dark cavity behind it, he pulled a small oilskin-wrapped package. He placed it on the table between them. "When I realized they were on to me, I knew I couldn't keep it on my person. I was scouting this area, looking for a place to lie low. I found an old, hollowed-out log down by the creek, not 50 yards from where you found me. I hid it there just before Corcoran and his men cornered me." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a weary shame. "I came back for it the first night I was able to walk on my own. While you were sleeping, the revelation settled in the small room, heavy and cold. The danger was no longer a vague suspicion based on fevered ramblings. It was here on her table, wrapped in oilskin. It was the reason he was shot, and it was the reason men would come looking for him. They wouldn't just be looking for a man to kill. They'd be looking for an object to retrieve, and they would tear apart anyone and anything that stood in their way. Lily slowly unwrapped the package. The ledger was small, bound in dark leather, its pages filled with neat, precise script. She looked from the book to Wade's face. The lie was gone, replaced by a truth that was infinitely more terrifying. "My father," she said, her voice hard as stone. "He was killed by men like that. Men who thought a piece of paper, a deed, was worth more than a man's life. Judge Merritt oversaw the inquest. He called it a dispute between neighbors and closed the case." Wade's face tightened, the pieces clicking into place. The shared enemy, the interconnectedness of their tragedies, was a cruel twist of fate. "Lily, I didn't know." "It doesn't matter if you knew," she said, pushing the ledger back towards him. "What matters is what you're going to do about it. That book is a death sentence for you and for anyone who helps you. As long as you're here, this homestead is a target." "I know," he said softly. "I'll leave in the morning. I'm strong enough now. I'll draw them away from you." Lillian Brewer stood up, her full height, seeming to fill the small room. She picked up her rifle, its weight familiar and comforting in her hands. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a cold, clear finality that surprised them both. "You won't. My father didn't run. I don't run. They brought their fight to my land. We're not going to run from it. We're going to finish it." In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted forever. She was no longer just his savior. He was no longer just her patient. They were partners, bound by a shared past of loss and a shared future of violent uncertainty. The ledger on the table was more than just evidence. It was the anvil on which their alliance was being forged. The decision to stay and fight transformed the homestead. The quiet pastoral rhythm of their days was replaced by a tense, purposeful urgency. Every sunrise brought with it the possibility of discovery, every sunset a prayer for one more night of peace. While Corcoran's men scoured the territory, their inquiries began to bear fruit in Redemption Creek. A stable boy recalled a homesteader woman, one who kept to herself, buying an unusual amount of oats and a new cinch for her saddle right after the big storm. He didn't know her name, but he knew the direction of her claim west along Cottonwood Creek. It was a small lead, but for a man like Corcoran, it was enough. He dispatched Peterson, his most relentless tracker, to ride a wide, looping patrol of the area. Peterson was a patient man, content to observe from a distance to let his prey reveal themselves. At the homestead, Wade and Lily were unaware of the specific threat, but they felt its presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. They became students of the horizon. They took turns watching from the roof of the soddy, using an old spyglass Lily's father had owned. One afternoon, it was Wade's turn. The sun was bright on the snow, the glare forcing him to squint. He swept the glass across the rolling plains of vast, empty canvas. Then he saw it, a glint of light miles away on the crest of a ridge. It wasn't natural. It was the sun reflecting off metal, a rifle barrel, or the lens of another spyglass. He watched for an hour, motionless. The glint disappeared, but a knot of cold dread formed in his stomach. It could have been a hunter, a trapper. But he knew better. It was the patient watchfulness of a predator. "We've been seen," he said to Lily that evening, his voice grim, "or at least my presence is suspected." Lily's face, illuminated by the fire, was a mask of calm determination. "How long do you figure we have?" "Depends on who it was. If it's just a scout, he'll report back. Corcoran will want to be sure. He won't risk his whole crew on a guess. He might send someone in closer, try to get a look inside. He'll want to confirm I'm here before he makes his move." Their fortress was their isolation, but it was also their greatest weakness. They were miles from any help, a single candle burning in an ocean of darkness. The town of Redemption Creek was the nearest settlement, but Wade knew it was compromised. "We need supplies," Lily said, thinking aloud. "More ammunition for one, and salt flour. If they lay siege to us, we need to be able to hold out." "It's too dangerous for you to go into town," Wade countered immediately. "They'll be looking for anyone connected to this area." "And it's impossible for you to go," she retorted. "I've been going to that town for 5 years. I'm a familiar face. I just need a good reason." She paused, her mind working. "Deputy Miller. He's always been decent to me. Helped me file the claim after Pa died. If I tell him I'm worried about rustlers in the area, it'll explain why I'm buying up cartridges for the Winchester. It's a believable story." Wade was uneasy. He didn't trust anyone, especially not a lawman in a town that might be under Judge Merritt's influence. But they had no choice. They were running low on essentials, and a fight was coming. 2 days later, Lily rode her steady mare, Bess, into Redemption Creek. The town was buzzing with more activity than usual. Groups of hard-looking men loitered outside the saloon, their eyes scanning every newcomer. Corcoran's influence was a palpable stain on the town's atmosphere. She tied Bess to the hitching post outside the general store and walked purposefully toward the sheriff's office. Deputy Miller was at his desk, a portly man with a kind face and thinning hair. He smiled warmly when he saw her. "Lillian, good to see you. Don't tell me that old fence of yours needs mending again," he chuckled. "Something like that, Ben," she replied, forcing a casual tone. "Seeing some unfamiliar tracks out my way. With winter coming, folks get desperate. Thought I'd best be prepared. Came to town for supplies, figured I'd let you know I might be firing off a few rounds to scare off coyotes. Or worse." Miller's friendly expression didn't change, but a shrewd, calculating light flickered in his eyes, so briefly Lily almost missed it. "Wise woman. Can't be too careful. There's a rough element passing through for sure. You see anyone specific, you let me know." "I will," she said. "Thanks, Ben." She left the office, her skin crawling. The interaction had felt wrong. His sympathy was too quick, his questions too few. She had known Ben Miller for years, but today he felt like a stranger wearing a familiar mask. She bought her supplies, including 3 boxes of 4440 cartridges, keenly aware of the storekeeper's curious glance. As she loaded her saddlebags, she saw him across the street. Peterson. She recognized his hulking frame and cruel porcine face from Wade's description of Corcoran's inner circle. He was trying to be inconspicuous, pretending to examine a horse's shoe, but his eyes were fixed on her. He had followed her, or he had been waiting for her. Her blood ran cold. The deputy. Miller had sent word. The ride home was the longest of her life. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing horse. She didn't dare look back. When she finally saw the thin curl of smoke from her homestead's chimney, she spurred Bess into a gallop, her heart hammering against her ribs. She burst through the door, her face pale. "They know," she gasped, dumping the supplies on the table. "They know I'm the one. Miller is with them. He's one of them." Wade's face went hard. The last glimmer of hope that they might be wrong, that the threat was just a phantom, vanished. The distant glint on the ridge, the deputy's betrayal, the noose was tightening. They were no longer waiting for a fight. The fight was now inevitable. The only question left was when the hangman would arrive. The revelation of Deputy Miller's betrayal lit a fire under them. There would be no more waiting, no more hoping. The enemy was not just outside the gates. They had a key. Miller knew the layout of her land, knew she was alone, or at least he thought she was. Corcoran would have all the information he needed. to plan his attack. "He'll think it's just you," Wade said, his mind racing, already shifting from homesteader to soldier. "He'll think he can send 2 or 3 men to overwhelm a lone woman quietly. He doesn't want to draw attention. He wants the ledger, not a war." He paced the small cabin, his limp more pronounced with his agitation. "That's our advantage, the element of surprise. They're coming for a shepherd, but they're going to find a wolf." The homestead transformed into a makeshift fortress. Their strategy was born of their combined skills, Wade's tactical military knowledge, and Lily's intimate understanding of every dip and rise of her land. "The windows are the weak points," Wade stated, running a hand over the simple wooden frames. "We can't board them completely. We'll need firing positions." Lily had an idea. "The old wagon Pa and I hauled out here. The bed is falling apart, but the oak planks are still solid." They spent the day dismantling the dilapidated wagon. Using a handsaw and hammer, they fashioned heavy wooden shutters for the inside of the 2 windows, and the door reinforcing them with iron straps from the wagon's harness. They were designed not just to be closed, but to be dropped into place and barred from within, turning the soddy into a small, defensible blockhouse. They left small, narrow slits in the shutters, just wide enough for a rifle barrel. Next, they turned their attention to the land itself. "They'll come from the east," Lily said, pointing from the doorway. "The terrain is flatter, gives them the best approach for a charge, but they'll use the creek bed for cover to get closer." "Then we make the cover a liability," Wade responded. They worked until their muscles ached and their hands were raw. In the tall grass leading from the creek, Wade showed Lily how to rig tripwires using old baling twine. They didn't have explosives, but they attached cowbells and stacks of old tin cans to the lines. It was a crude alarm system, but in the dead of night, the sudden jarring noise would be enough to ruin any stealthy approach. Lily, remembering the harsh winter of 704, led Wade to a low-lying patch of ground near the barn. "This area floods and freezes over," she explained. "Looks solid, but the ice is thin here." During the night, they hauled bucket after bucket of water from the well, pouring it over the area. The freezing temperatures did the rest, creating a treacherous, hidden sheet of ice under a light dusting of snow. Their most ingenious defense was born from Lily's pragmatism. She pointed to the massive old woodpile stacked against the north side of the barn. If they try to use the barn for cover or to set it on fire, Wade understood instantly. They spent 2 hours rigging a complex system of ropes and props. With a single hard pull on a rope tied off inside the house, the entire massive woodpile, tons of seasoned oak and pine, would collapse outwards, burying anyone foolish enough to take cover beside it. As they worked, a new level of respect grew between them. He was no longer just a wounded man she had saved. He was a competent, strategic partner. And she was no longer just a compassionate caregiver. She was a resourceful, unyielding fighter. They moved together with an unspoken synergy, their shared purpose forging a bond stronger than any words. That night, as they sat inside their newly fortified home, the weight of the coming battle settled upon them. The ledger was hidden again, this time deep within the stone foundation of the hearth. Their weapons were cleaned and loaded. Ammunition was laid out in easy reach on the table. "I never asked for this," Lily said quietly, her voice tired. She was staring into the fire, its light dancing in her weary eyes. "I just wanted to be left alone." Wade looked at her, at the strength in her profile, the calluses on her hands, the fierce independence that defined her. "Corcoran's kind," he said, his voice laced with a grim certainty. "They don't let people be. They see something simple and good, and they have to either own it or crush it. They can't stand the idea that something can exist without their permission." He paused, his gaze softening. "You saved my life, Lily. I swore an oath to the Union once. It was about protecting the innocent, defending what's right. I failed a lot of people along the way. I won't fail you. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was an oath sworn not to a flag or a government, but to a single person. A promise made in the heart of a storm now being honored on the brink of a war. Lily gave a small, sad smile. Well, Wade Donovan, let's hope your oaths are as sturdy as these walls. They sat in silence, listening to the wind outside. It sounded different now. It no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like the deep, indrawn breath of the world, holding itself still before the inevitable violence to come. The attack came just before dawn, in the grey liminal hour when the world is drained of colour and courage is at its lowest ebb. The first warning was not from their tripwires, but from the low, nervous whinny of Bess in the barn. Wade was instantly awake, moving from his bedroll to the window slit with the silent grace of a predator. Lily was right behind him, her Winchester already in her hands. Peering through the narrow opening, they saw them. 4 riders moving slowly, cautiously from the direction of the creek. They were dark silhouettes against the pale eastern sky. One of them was Peterson. The other 3 were hard-faced men Wade recognized from Corcoran's gang. But Corcoran himself was not among them. "This is a probing attack," Wade whispered, his voice taut. "He sent them to test the defenses, maybe snatch you. He thinks it's easy." "Let's show him how wrong he is." Lily breathed, her heart pounding a steady cold rhythm against her ribs. The men dismounted near the creek bed, tying their horses, and advancing on foot, spreading out to approach the cabin from 2 sides. 2, including Peterson, came straight on. The other 2 circled around towards the barn. This was it. The first sound was the sudden frantic clatter of tin cans and the jarring clang of a cowbell as one of the men on the flank stumbled through their tripwire. Curses split the morning quiet. The element of surprise was shattered. "Now," Wade commanded. He sighted on one of the men caught in the open and fired. The roar of his Colt peacemaker inside the cabin was deafening. The man cried out and dropped to one knee, clutching his leg. Simultaneously, Lily's Winchester boomed its deeper report echoing across the plains. She didn't aim for a man, but for the ground in front of Peterson, kicking up a spray of dirt and snow that made him dive for cover. Gunfire erupted from the attackers. Bullets thudded into the thick sod walls and ricocheted off the heavy oak shutters with sharp, splintering cracks. The battle had begun. The 2 men near the barn, recovering from the initial shock, used the structure for cover and began laying down suppressing fire on the cabin. "The woodpile!" Lily yelled over the din. Wade nodded, never taking his eye from his slit. Wait for it!" One of the men, emboldened, broke from cover and sprinted for the north wall of the barn, seeking a better firing angle. It was the exact spot. "Do it!" Wade yelled. Lily didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy rope they had rigged and pulled with all her might. Outside, the support props gave way with a groan of tortured wood. For a half-second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like rolling thunder, the entire massive woodpile collapsed outwards. The gunman disappeared under an avalanche of logs. A single choked cry was swallowed by the immense crashing weight. He wouldn't be getting up. His partner, seeing this, let out a yell of rage and terror. He fired wildly at the cabin, then made a fatal mistake. He turned to run back towards the creek. Wade's pistol cracked once. The man stumbled, fell, and lay still in the snow. 2 down. Peterson and the remaining gunmen were now pinned down behind a small rise in the terrain. They were firing sporadically, but their assault had lost all momentum. They had expected a frightened woman, not a prepared deadly defense. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the gunfire, the thunder of approaching hooves and not from the creek. A lone rider was charging towards the homestead from the south, a rifle in his hand. It was Corcoran. He had been waiting in reserve, observing. Seeing his plan failing, he was entering the fray himself. With him was Deputy Ben Miller, his face a pale mask of fear, looking less like a willing accomplice and more like a man being forced into a fight he wanted no part of. "It's him and Miller," Wade snarled. Corcoran was a brilliant tactician. He wasn't charging the cabin. He was charging the barn, aiming to set it ablaze to smoke them out. "I'll take Corcoran," Wade said, his voice deadly calm. "You take the deputy. Don't kill him if you can help it. We need him to testify." Lily nodded, her jaw set. This was for her father. As Corcoran and Miller galloped closer, Lily took a deep, steadying breath. She tracked Miller in her sights, leading him just slightly. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against her shoulder. Miller cried out and tumbled from his saddle, his arm bloody, his horse veering away in panic. Wade's attention was entirely on Corcoran. He fired twice with the Colt. One shot went wide. The other struck Corcoran's horse in the neck. The animal screamed and went down in a chaotic tangle of legs, throwing Corcoran clear. Corcoran landed hard, but rolled to his feet, his fine coat torn and muddied. He came up with his own revolver in hand. At the same time, Wade burst from the cabin door, leaving the safety of its walls to meet his nemesis on open ground. It was no longer about tactics or ledgers. It was personal. Peterson and the last gunman saw their chance. With the cabin door open, they laid down a hail of fire. Lily, seeing the danger, shoved the heavy table on its side, creating a shield of thick oak. She knelt behind it and returned fire, her shots, accurate and deadly, forcing the two men to keep their heads down. Outside, it was a classic Western duel. Wade and Corcoran faced each other across 30 yards of snow-dusted ground. "It's over, Lawrence," Wade yelled, his voice carrying in the cold air. "Your men are dead or dying. Miller is down. Give it up." Corcoran laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Give up, Donovan, you of all people should know. I never give up. I just take what's mine." He raised his pistol and fired. Wade fired a split second later. The two shots sounded almost as one. Wade felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his left shoulder, spinning him around. But his own shot had flown true. Corcoran stood stunned for a second, a dark, spreading stain appearing on the chest of his tailored suit. He looked down at it in disbelief, then his cold, winter sky eyes met Wade's. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. He crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror ending in the mud of a lonely homestead. Seeing their leader fall, Peterson and the last outlaw broke and ran for their horses. Lily sighted on Peterson, the man who had spied on her, who had brought this violence to her home. Her finger tightened on the trigger, but then she stopped. She lowered the rifle. The killing was done. Wade staggered towards Corcoran's body, his own wound bleeding freely. He knelt, checking for any sign of life. There was none. He looked up at the cabin, at Lily standing in the doorway, rifle in hand, her face smudged with gunpowder, her expression fierce and beautiful. She had saved him again. She rushed to his side, tearing a strip from her apron to press against his new wound. "You reckless fool," she said, her voice thick with a mixture of anger and relief. He looked at her, a genuine weary smile touching his lips. It's what the oath required. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the battlefield. Ben Miller was groaning, clutching his shattered arm. The remaining outlaws were disappearing over the horizon. It was over. Wade looked at Lillian Brewer, the woman who had dragged him from the mud, nursed him back to life, and fought by his side. She was his harbor, his fortress, and his partner. He had come to her as a wounded warrior, a man running from his past. And in her strength, he had found his future. He had sworn his life to hers in the quiet of his own recovering heart, and here in the aftermath of blood and gunfire, he knew he would spend the rest of his days honoring that vow. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something new and resilient had begun to grow. And so on the quiet plains of Wyoming, a story that began with a storm ended not with a whisper, but with the roar of righteous gunfire. Lillian Brewer and Wade Donovan, two strangers forged into an unbreakable alliance by violence and virtue, stood together in the aftermath. The ledger would find its way to Cheyenne, and with the testimony of a wounded and remorseful Deputy Miller, it would finally bring men like Judge Merritt to justice, cleansing a corruption that had cost Lily her father. But more than that, a new legacy was written that day. It was a story of resilience, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, decency can take root. It was a story of an oath not sworn before a flag, but whispered in a grateful heart, a promise from a warrior to the woman who became his entire world. Their tale reminds us that the deepest bonds are often forged in the hottest fires, and that sometimes the greatest treasures we find are the lives we fight to save. If their story of courage and loyalty moved you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share this piece of the Old West with someone who loves a tale of true grit, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of history, heart, and the untamed human spirit. Thank you for listening.